Hello. This is the second and final part of my discussion about Western Baha'is and the overall development of the Baha'i faith. It comes from this essay I wrote, published back in 2004, The Baha'i Faith in the West, a survey published by Kalimat. So in the previous video I talked about the role in which the Baha'is in the West played in the overall expansion of the Baha'i religion worldwide, and in this present video I'll talk about the role in the development of Baha'i administration and what I've termed cultural expressions. So administration. This is an area in which the Western Baha'is have made a significant contribution to the development of the Baha'i faith as a whole in relationship to what has come to be termed the Baha'i administrative order. Baha'i administrative institutions existed in Iran from an early date, but the modern system of directive assemblies and their subsidiary institutions, together with the use of systematic planning, was pioneered largely in the West, under the guidance of Shoghi Effendi and in consultation with such prominent Western Baha'is as Horace Holly, the long-time secretary of the American National Assembly. I've described elsewhere many administrative innovations were first made in North America and then extended to other Baha'i communities. This is Horace Holly, the secretary of the American Baha'is for a long time, and a major player, if you like, in the development of Baha'i administration, or major contributor, maybe that's a better word. So, administrative functioning. Some indication of the leading administrative role played by Western Baha'is can be gained from the figures for assembly formation. In 1928, despite constituting only a tiny minority of the total Baha'i population, Western Baha'is had formed some 67% of the world's then total of local spiritual assemblies. That's 68 out of 102. Even by 1987, they still formed over 16%. That's 3,020 out of 19,273 of the local assemblies then in existence, whilst at that time they constituted less than 5% of the estimated world Baha'i population. Another important indicator is the high level of administrative functioning in the Western Baha'i communities. Again, as with previous videos, you'll have to look up the original published article for more details and the sources. Thus, for the West as a whole, 76% of local assemblies reported in 1987 that they held the regular 19-day feast, which is the religious focus of Baha'i community life. Some 71% also reported that the assembly itself held regular business meetings. Considering that the local Baha'i communities in the West are mostly quite small, and that the faith itself has very few professional administrators and no priesthood, and thus must rely on the voluntary endeavors of its rank and file members, these are impressively high figures. They compare with only 34% of assemblies worldwide holding feasts and 30% holding regular business meetings. These more modest figures reflect the greater difficulty in administrative functioning that is experienced by many Baha'i communities in the global south. Western prominence in the development of the administrative order is partly attributable to the prevailing conditions of religious freedom in the West, which also enabled Baha'i institutions often to gain legal recognition. A second factor was the resourceful and educated nature of the Western Baha'i population, a factor that probably accounts for the high level of administrative functioning in the West. The second factor also enabled Western Baha'is to play a prominent role in the development of the faith's international and initially global South leadership. Western Baha'is, often active as the primary agents of the global diffusion of the Baha'i administrative system, and they were subsequently prominent, at least initially, amongst the memberships of both the National Spiritual Assemblies and auxiliary board members throughout much of the global south. Their role has since lessened with the increasing number of indigenous believers in positions of leadership. But at the time that I wrote the article in the 1990s, Westerners still occupied then leadership positions in many Baha'i communities in the global south. I should say that my impression is that since I wrote the article, that indigenization process has developed much further, and now Western Baha'is play only a marginal role there. As regards the Baha'i faith's international leadership, it's significant that of the 36 individuals who were appointed by Shokri Effendi as hands of the cause between 1951 and 1957, or as members of the First International Baha'i Council from 1951 to 61, 23, that's 64%, were Westerners. Of the rest, 12 were Iranian and 1 was Ugandan, at that time the only Baha'i from the global south, in a position of high leadership. Similarly, of the 20 individuals selected to the Second International Baha'i Council from 1961 to 63, or the Universal House of Justice from 1963 up to 1998 for these figures, 15 were Westerners, 11 Americans, 2 British, 1 Australian, 1 Canadian, and 5 were Iranians, all with strong links outside of Iran. Finally, of the 67 councillors appointed in 1980, 26, that's 39%, were Westerners. The third area in which Western Baha'is have played a prominent role in the overall development of the Baha'i faith has been in the diversification of its cultural expressions and intellectual life. Let me add a sociological footnote here. Cultural expressions here refers to all formal and informal patterns of behavior and belief that are characteristic of a religious group as a collectivity and which new members acquire through socialization. They include the forms and styles of interaction between members, the conduct of meetings, both formal and informal, forms of organization, attitudes towards outsiders and towards the socialization of children and new members, forms of personal behavior and appearance, dress, hair, and so on, artistic expressions, intellectual expressions, folk tales, formal religious codes, scriptural interpretations, and so on, constitute a specialized form of cultural expression. As in most religious movements, only a few of the cultural expressions of being a Baha'i are scripturally prescribed. Many patterns of Baha'i collective life emerge in the process of group interaction. In the Baha'i case, these now vary quite considerably from one society to another, no doubt reflecting both the diversity of Baha'i membership and the Baha'i principle of tolerance of diversity. Even though the early Western Baha'i groups were quite small when they were first established, they significantly expanded the range of ways in which the Baha'i movement found cultural expression. The Western Baha'is were not Occidental transplantations of Iranian or Middle Eastern Baha'i culture. The Western Baha'is developed their own cultural expressions of their religion, as, for example, in the forms of their meetings and organizations, their use of American Protestant religious styles such as hymnody, and most consciously, their development of distinctively Western presentations of the Baha'i teachings. Although some Western Baha'is were given Persian names by Abdu'l-Baha, and there was widespread use of a few Oriental terms, such as the salutation Allah-Pa, Oriental forms in general were not adopted. Baha'is retained their Western personal names, their behavioral styles, dress, and appearance. This contrasts markedly with the behavior of Western converts to some other immigrant religions. The development of distinctively Western presentations of the Baha'i teachings has yet been little researched. Quite clearly, the Western Baha'is lived in a very different cultural and intellectual milieu from that of their co-religionists in the Middle East. In reflecting on their new religion, and more specifically in attempting to present it to their American, British, French, and German compatriots, the early Western Baha'is were necessarily concerned with their own cultural issues. This is quite clearly shown by the types of questions they addressed to Abdul-Baha in the extensive tablets that we have from him. For example, the early text of the book's Unanswered Questions deals with topics such as biblical interpretation, Christian doctrine, evolutionism, reincarnation, spiritual healing, and industrial disputes. That was published in 1908, I should say. It's also shown by the writings of early Western exponents of the Baha'i teachings, such as I.G. Khairullah, Hippolyte Dreyfus, Charles Mason Remy, Horace Holly, and John E. Esselmont, all of whom wrote in the early period of Baha'i expansion into the West. Abdul-Baha took a very active role in shaping the development of Baha'i belief in the West, but this development can best be understood as an interactive process between him and his followers. A similar interactive process occurred during the leadership of Shawki Effendi, with individuals such as Holly and George Townsend making major contributions to the development of Baha'i thinking. More recently, the enormous expansion of Western Baha'i secondary literature reflects the continuing contribution of Western Baha'is in this area. The prominent role of Westerners in the recent development of Baha'i scholarship should also be noted. Given the general cultural dominance of the West in the modern world, Western Baha'i ways of doing things have had a major influence on Baha'i communities outside the West. The most important single instance of this has been the emergence of English as the principal language of international Baha'i communication, but it's also expressed in the preeminence of Western Baha'i secondary literature and the prominence of Western styles in areas such as form of meetings, dress, and music. In the original paper I wrote, I also had quite a long section on Baha'i demographics in the West, based on the data I had available at the time I was writing it. I've omitted that entirely from these videos. It's very hard to summarize, and it involves a lot of statistics. So if you want to look at that, I'm afraid you'll have to look up the original article. I'm not going to deal with it now. So that's all I'm going to say about the Baha'i faith in the West for the moment. If you want a general overview of Baha'i history, then there's my Cambridge book, The Babi and Baha'i Religions. There's also a short history from One World. And in terms of the Baha'i faith in general, there's my Cambridge introduction and a concise encyclopedia from One World again. So particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which it would be hard for me to make these videos. And thank you to you also if you've been listening to all of this video and this series of videos. I hope you found them interesting, and I will come back to the subject no doubt at some future date, but not immediately. If you want to support my channel, you're very welcome. It really does help me a lot. Like, comment, and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and, for the moment, PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll do something entirely different, and I'll talk about sociological theories regarding the emergence and development of new religious movements. Have a good day.